Herzlich willkommen. Es funktioniert. Herzlich.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of Philippe Sands. I see many familiar faces, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this event of the Literature on the Ring Street series of events. My name is Marie-Therese Arnborg. I will be your moderator this evening. Let me start by, first of all, thank the Secretary General of the Austrian Parliament, Harald Dossi, who cannot be with us tonight, unfortunately, but his deputy, Susanne Janistin Novak, was able to join us. We are delighted to have you here for this book presentation, which you will open in a few moments. And I'm also delighted, of course, to welcome the protagonist of tonight's event, Philippe Sands, an author, lawyer, professor. I don't want to start into I don't even want to get into naming all the functions he holds. Let me just say welcome very, very much to you, Philippe. We're also pleased to welcome the former State Secretary and member of the European Parliament, Ulrike Lunacek. Thank you for being here. I would also like to welcome all active and former members of Parliament, be it the National or the Federal Council. Thank you for being here with us in this event held at the Austrian Parliament. And last but not least, I would like to give a very warm welcome to our audience here on site and online. There will be a live stream that will be available also later on, so be careful what you say. No chance of covering up any mistakes. Thank you for being here with us, and I would like to wish you an exciting and very interesting evening. Thank you.
Sehr geehrte Damen,
ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Austrian Parliament, to a highly interesting event during which the newest book of Philippe Sands, 38 Londres Street on Impunity, Pinochet in England and a Nazi in Patagonia, will be presented. The Parliament's library is starting the Literature on the Ring Street series of events of this year. Let me first of all introduce the best-selling author and human rights lawyer Philippe Sands and his roots in Vienna. His grandfather, Leon Buchholz, was born in Lviv but then lived in Vienna. He had to flee Austria after the German Wehrmacht entered Austria in 1938. He then escaped to France. Philippe Sands speaks about his grandfather's life in his book East-West Street on the Origins of Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity. This is a personal history that was published in 2016 and in 2018 in German. His next book also has strong links to Austria. It's called Red Line: Love, Lies and Justice on the Trail of a Nazi Fugitive, published in 2020. In this book, Sands examines the life of high-ranking Nazi criminal Otto Wächter and what was called the Red Line, the escape route that led via South Tyrol and Rome to other countries and allowed many Nazis to reach South America, in some cases with the active support of Austrian Bishop Alois Hudal. In South America, therefore, victims who escaped the Nazi dictatorship will meet and sometimes live next door with former Nazis. In his research, Philippe Sands also comes across the name of Walter Rauff, a war criminal who was greatly involved in the mass murder in the East and in the development of gas lorries that were used to kill Roma, Sintis, and Jews. All of this is the foundation of his latest book, 38 Londres Street, on impunity, Pinochet in England and the Nazi in Patagonia, which tells the story of NS criminal and former SS officer Walter Rauff, who managed to escape to Chile in 1949. There, as of 1973, he starts working for the military dictatorship led by Augusto Pinochet. In the basement of the building at 38 Londres Street, the staff and henchmen of the Chilean Secret Service torture and kill people. It is here that political opponents of the regime disappear, dissidents, inconvenient people disappear, and so do their rights. The disappeared, the desaparecidos as they are called in Spanish, are the victims of one of the most brutal military dictatorships in South America in the 1970s. The fate of many men and women who disappeared during this dictatorship remains unsolved. Pinochet tells us about his research about these disappeared people and his attempts to uncover murder and killing. And therefore he contributes to the fact that the memory of the victims of this dictatorship will always kept alive. In 1998, Pinochet is arrested in London, and Philippe Sands is directly involved in the events. Exactly how will be discussed later this evening. The fact that it was possible to arrest Pinochet at all, and the question associated with it on the accountability and immunity of heads of state when they are abroad, caused a stir, and it was also unheard of in legal terms. Because of his ill health, however, Pinochet could never be brought to justice. Reconstructing the events in the United Kingdom is part of the second strand Sands follows in his book. He writes a dual story about mass murder and torture, and about the possibilities and limits of the law, spanning and linking two brutal dictatorships and criminals in several decades. He speaks with the surviving family members, people who were involved in the events or witnessed them. And at the same time, he provides a first-hand glance into an international criminal trial of historic significance. In closing, I would like to warmly thank Marie-Therese Arnbaum for preparing and moderating today's discussion. And my special thanks obviously go to our guest this evening, to Professor Philippe Sands, who will give us a very interesting and definitely enlightening insight into his book and how it came into being. And I would now like to hand over to Marie-Therese Arnbaum for a more detailed introduction.
Wir werden jetzt dann auf Englisch switchen.
We will soon switch to English, so those of you who want to can listen to the interpretation, which will be provided into English. There will also be sign language interpretation also available on the live stream. So now, why is it the two of us who are sitting here? How did we meet?
Do you want to start? Or shall I start? How we met?
Well, before we say anything, I do have to express my gratitude to colleagues in this Parliament, to you, Marie-Therese. As you will know, for me to be present in the Parliament of the Austrian Republic is personally very touching and very affecting and very significant. As you know, I have Austria and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in my DNA, and in my blood, and it is a big part of my being. My mother was born here in July 1938, which, if you were Jewish, was not an ideal moment. And she fled, saved by a remarkable lady, Miss Elsie Tilney, as I describe in Rückkehr nach Lemberg, an evangelical Christian missionary who came to the Westbahnhof and took a one-year-old infant to France, where she was hidden and, happily for me, made it on. Today is an important day for another reason. It happens to be the birthday of my beloved grandfather. And so to be here with you on this day, on which, as many of you know, there has been a very important announcement in the city of Lviv that a special tribunal for the crime of aggression will be established, the first time since Nuremberg. So this is a really significant day, and I begin just by expressing my deep gratitude to all of you for coming and for gracing me with your presence. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Philipp Sands should be in Lemberg today, but he preferred to come to us. Thanks a lot. Yes, how did we meet? Just in a very short way. I got the Red Line as a Christmas present in 2020, and I read it, and then there was written that Otto Wächter was the man who expelled all the people from the state in 1938, and suddenly I read the name of my great-grandfather. And so I had, of course, the paper, and then I scanned it, and I Googled Philipp Sands on the 26th of December, and I sent it to him, and I asked him, is this really the signature of Otto Wächter? And he told me yes. And so we got in touch, and so we stayed in touch, and this is a very long story, but we don't to speak about everything.
But you've missed the best bit of the story, because not only did she, so I'm, you know, the 26th in England is a holiday. It's called Boxing Day, so you don't get any emails. And my wife gets upset with me when I look at my emails on Boxing Day or Christmas Day or any other holiday, but I secretly check my emails. And I get this email from this person that I don't know, and she tells me the story of her great-grandfather, Robert Winterstein, who was a former Minister of Justice. In fact, I've been today in the Landesgericht and the building where he worked in the 1930s with my dear friend Martina Schweitzer, who is the vice president here in Vienna. But what Maria Therese has left out from this extraordinary email that she sent me was she basically said, I'm not only writing to tell you about my great-grandfather's story and your book's assistance in opening up our family knowledge of the circumstances of his loss of office and banishment to Buchenwald, where he perished. Let us not forget this also. But she said, I live in the house of my great-grandfather, and here in Vienna. And my next-door neighbor, for many, many years, who is my great friend, is the granddaughter of Otto Wächter. And this, I thought, was absolutely remarkable. Life is full of incredible coincidences, and I so appreciated that you took the trouble to write to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, but we start now to speak about this book, because each book is coming out of another book. So I think you're writing a book, and out of this book you have 20 ideas for new books. It's like quite similar to me. But now we heard a little bit about the content of the book, but now I just want to ask you why Augusto Pinochet and Walter Rauf, and I have a small part from your book, and you can read it by yourself. Sure. It's better.
I will read it. Let me just, by way of context, when I started this project in 2010, I received an invitation in April of that year to give a lecture in the University of Lviv on the cases I had been involved in before international courts on crimes against humanity and genocide. I had never heard of Lviv, to be perfectly frank. I Googled it. I saw that Lviv was Lvov, Lvov, Leopolis, Lemberg. Lemberg. I've heard of Lemberg. Lemberg was where my grandfather was born. And so I suddenly get interested. And I end up agreeing to give the lecture, not because I have a burning desire to give a lecture, but because I want to find the house where my grandfather was born. Why? Because it will help me explain more about the identity of my grandfather, and in understanding more about the identity of my grandfather, who never spoke about Lemberg and who almost never spoke about Vienna because it was too painful, I would know more about who I was in terms of my roots and my origins. I visit, I discover, unbelievably, but by accident, that Lemberg is the home of these two great jurists, Hirsch Lauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin, and that the origins of these two legal concepts, crimes against humanity and genocide, dates to this University of Lviv, where they were both students, Lemberg, Lvov, and the origins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I write a book about it. The three men, Lauterpacht, Lemkin, Leon Buchholz, my grandfather, and I add a fourth man, Hans Frank, who has been the lawyer of Adolf Hitler from 1928 to 1933, and then becomes Gouverneur General of Nazi-occupied Poland. And that book is published in 2016. In writing the book, I meet and get to know Nicholas Frank, the son, one of the 5 children of Hans Frank, and we develop a good relationship. It's complex, but it's a good relationship. He's a remarkable man, a very distinguished journalist. He's still around, and we've become very close. And one day he says to me, Philippe, you're interested in Lemberg. Would you like to meet the gouverneur of Lemberg, the son of the gouverneur of Lemberg, Horst Wächter? And I say, sure. He communicates with Horst, who is present with us this evening, and Horst very generously agrees to meet with me. And one thing leads to another, and Horst gives me access to the private family archive of his parents, Otto and Charlotte, and that becomes the basis for writing Die Rattenlinie. In the archive of 10,000 words, I find a letter of 3 pages by a man called Walter Rauff, who I'd vaguely heard of, but I'd forgotten that I'd heard of him because he features in well-known works of literature, a book by Bruce Chatwin called In Patagonia, and a wonderful novel by the Chilean writer Roberto Bolaño, Nights in Chile. And I start inquiring about who Walter Rauff is, and I learn about his past, his closeness to Wächter, his closeness to Reinhard Heydrich and Himmler, and Karl Wolff, and that he ends up on the rat line living in Chile. And at that point, I become interested because 15 years earlier, I had been involved in a case in London on whether or not Augusto Pinochet, as a former head of state of Chile, was or was not entitled to claim immunity from the jurisdiction of the English courts for acts that amounted to crimes against humanity and genocide. So that's the context. Now, in doing the research, I talked to a lot of people on all sides of the story. And one of the styles of my writing, and we'll come back to this, is I don't judge anybody. It's for you, the reader, to look at the material and form your own view about these characters and what they've done and why they've done it and why certain things happen. One of the people that I meet is a Supreme Court justice in Chile, Mario Carosa, the man who's done more of the human rights and Pinochet-era crimes cases than any other judge. And I go to see him because I want to know whether accounts given to me by 2 former agents of the Chilean intelligence services on the subject of Walter Rauff, can I rely on them? Are they credible? And during the conversation, Justice Carosa turns around and starts asking me questions. Judge Carosa turned to me. Why was I interested in this story and Ralph's role in the crimes of Augusto Pinochet? It was a decent question. It began with the law, how the crimes invented for Nuremberg were taken forward, the interplay between immunity and impunity. There was, too, a personal connection, my involvement in Pinochet's case in London, my feelings about the outcome, and the circumstances of his return to Chile, and the discovery of a family connection through my wife with the killing of Carmelo Soria in 1976. Then another personal connection, as I discovered along the way that one of the many murdered in Ralph's vans in Poland was Herta Gruber. She was 12 years old, my mother's older cousin from Vienna. Mario Carosa listened attentively. I knew a detainee at Londres 38, he said. He was with me at university, El Pedagogico. We studied philosophy together. This was a reference to the Pedagogical Institute at the University of Chile. His name was Alfonso Chanfrot. Our eyes met. It is a fine thing to investigate for a personal reason, said Judge Carosa. A very fine thing.
Thank you. These coincidences and all these people you meet, I think your research is always on two levels. The level of the facts and the level of a personal relationship. And I think all these conversations you have with all these different people from different places and with a lot of coincidences. There's one story, you are sitting with somebody in the taxi and discussing Ralph, and so the taxi driver turned around and told, oh yes, it's all true. So there were meetings you didn't expect, of course, but I think all these conversations, everything you get out of it forms a main part of your book.
So you have to understand that I am first and foremost a litigator before international courts. And as a litigator before international courts, the question you always worry about is when the judge says to you, yes, indeed, Mr. Sands, but what is your evidence for that proposition? And I can't say to the judge, a taxi driver in Santiago told me that this was the case. I need more than that. I need documents, or I need accounts by people who have first-hand experience. And so I spend a lot of time talking to people. I think it's probably just worth spending a moment on coincidences. And this is a big matter of disagreement between me and my wife. She thinks the coincidences are just total coincidences. I don't. I feel that there is something else that is at play that causes these extraordinary coincidences to happen. I mean, the coincidences began with Rückkehr nach Lemberg because it turned out that my great-grandmother, my grandfather's mother, was born in the town of Żółkiew near Lemberg, and that was where Hirsch Lauterpacht was born. And Hirsch Lauterpacht's son was my first teacher in international law at Cambridge University. So this was a curious coincidence. But in this book, the coincidences are really wild. So the unknown magistrate who signed the arrest warrant of Augusto Pinochet on the 16th of October, 1998, had never before happened in history. This was a completely revolutionary act. He happens to be Nicholas Evans, my next-door neighbor. The famous judge, Lord Hoffman, who caused so much difficulty in the proceedings involving Pinochet because it turned out that he had a relationship with Amnesty International, which he had not declared to the parties before the first case began on immunity before the House of Lords, which meant that the House of Lords had to set aside the judgment and start again. My father was Lord Hoffman's dentist for 40 years. The point is, these coincidences become important because when you're contacting someone, will you have a conversation with me? Neither Lord Hoffman nor the magistrate, Nicholas Evans, had ever talked to anyone. But when the person who asks you is known to you in some way, there is a level of trust that they know I'm going to be very careful, I'm going to respect what they say, I will treat it respectfully. But the biggest coincidence is this. When Die Rattenlinie came out in Spanish language in February 2021, I received an email from my editor at Anagrama. She said there is a Spanish prosecutor, Carlos Castrasana, who would like to speak to you about the Pinochet case because he read in El País that your next book will be about Pinochet and Ralph. Would you accord him an interview? I said, of course. We spoke by Zoom. It was during COVID. And he told me the whole history of how the Pinochet case started with 4 Chilean refugees in Spain who approached him. And he ended up saying, yes, there is a legal basis under Spanish law to bring a case involving international crimes, genocide and crimes against humanity, and torture and disappearance against Pinochet in the Spanish cause. But, he said, I need a Spanish victim. Why? The Spanish courts are very conservative. They may see there's a legal basis, but frankly, with a Chilean victim, they may say, this doesn't really concern us. Let us proceed only with a Spanish victim. So the Chilean refugees come back with various names. They give 4 names, and Carlos Castrasana chooses one person to be the first case, which will open the dossier of the case against Augusto Pinochet under criminal law of Spain in July 1996. The name of the person, which I have just read out, is Carmelo Soria. Carmelo Soria was the head of the United Nations office in Santiago when, on the 14th of July 1976, he was abducted off the streets and disappeared. His body appears 3 days later. He is dead in a canal. He has been murdered by the Pinochet regime. That is the case I started the Pinochet proceedings with. Carlos Castrasana, the prosecutor who started the case, told me in 1996. And I chose him because he was a dual national of Spain and Chile. He had diplomatic immunity under international law as a UN diplomat, and he came from a very well-known family in Spain. His grandfather was Arturo Soria, who was an urban planner. There is a street named in Madrid and even a subway station named after Arturo Soria. And Carmelo Soria's own brother, also called Arturo Soria, was the publisher of Pablo Neruda. And so this was a well-known family. Fine. I listened. I'd never heard of Carmelo Soria. We carried on talking. I finished. I happened to be in the southwest of England in a small town called Totnes, where my mother-in-law lives. My mother-in-law, who's a wonderful person, happens to be Spanish. She is a refugee from the Spanish Civil War. Her father, my wife's grandfather, was a military man. He was a colonel in the Republican Army who fled in 1939 and ended up as a refugee living in England. I tell my mother-in-law the story as I've told it to you, and she says, what was the name of the gentleman again who was abducted, who started the whole Pinochet case? I said, Carmelo Soria. She looks at me, she's silent, she pauses, and she says, of course, I'd forgotten. It was 50 years ago. Cousin Carmelo. So the curiosity is that East-West Street starts with my grandfather and my own family, and then totally unbeknownst to me, I'm involved in this writing project, and the coincidence shifts to my wife's family. So immediately, of course, apropos your question, I get in touch with the Soria family. I'm treated like family. I'm treated like the unknown cousin from England.
Quite an unknown cousin from England.
I mean, again, my wife tells me off because she says, well, they're not really cousins. It's cousins by marriage. But anyone here who has a Spanish or Chilean connection will understand that for British people, family is like this. For Chilean and Spanish people, family is like this. And so I'm immediately embraced, and that gives me access to people and to conversations which are very extensive, and they become, as you know from the book, incredibly important. And it's my experience as a litigator that I've come to understand that it's very important, if you're talking to people, to build trust. they won't say things to you unless they feel you're going to respectfully treat what they say, give them space, not challenge them, not be rude about them, and just allow them to say their things. And so it's repeated engagements with many, many people over 6 or 7 years. That's what I did with East West Street, that's what I did with Die Radlinie, and that's what I've done with this book. And as you know, some of the characters that I speak to are extraordinary characters. Some of them are mass murderers, some of them, you know, one of them was Augusto Pinochet's most trusted lawyer, who I came to know very well, and we spoke very openly.
You write in one point in the book, I have learned through my work on international disputes that there is much to be gained by visiting a place that words alone are not able to give a complete sense of geography and the impregnation of history. And I think this is very important because you went to all these places in Chile. I don't know how often you were there, but from my feeling you were there 100 times. So and you really went to small villages, to all these places where it happened. And I think this is so important to go there and to see it.
Yes, you know this. You do the same thing. Your wonderful book about buildings and in various parts of Austria, you've understood. You can't just go on the internet and look at a picture of something. When you're doing a case, you have to go to the place. When you're doing a case, for example, about the pollution of a river, I was involved in a famous case involving the pollution of the Danube, or allegations about the pollution of the Danube, a dispute between Hungary and Slovakia in the 1990s. You have to go and see the river. You have to go and see the barrage. You have to go and get a sense of the scale, the size, the speed of flow, what is happening. When you're dealing with a case about mass murder, I'm afraid you have to go and see sometimes the bodies. You have to go and see the places of killing. You have to go and see the mass graves. And I've always had this instinct. I was telling someone who I just saw for the first time in 30 years here about the first time that I came to Austria. You know, you have to understand that growing up, I grew up in a family where we weren't allowed to have German and Austrian things at home. That was how it was. And of course it has changed completely. In fact, I remember meeting my first Austrian person when I was 18 years old at university, an absolutely wonderful individual called Gerhard Baumgartner, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight. Some of you will know him. He was the sort of German lector at Cambridge University. And I was like, you know, I met this fellow and he seemed very normal and he seemed very nice, and we became friends, and it opened my door to understanding that there's wonderful people around everywhere in every country, and you can't have this sort of closed mind as to how things are. But the truth is, I only came to Vienna for the first time in 1988, and I was 27 years old. And I came because I was on the delegation of Greenpeace International in negotiations at the International Atomic Energy Agency on the post-Chernobyl negotiation of rules on liability for damage. So, you know, I was sort of excited to come to Austria and Vienna, and I spent a lot of time just walking around. I'd found from my mother various addresses, you know, on Taborstrasse and various other places, and I just wanted to get a feel. And as you walk, what happens to me is your imagination opens up. You know, you are able to imagine how it was when my grandfather arrived here in 1914 as a 10-year-old boy to escape the Russians who had occupied Lemberg. And, you know, it's a small world. History goes round and round. It doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it has a certain circular aspect. And for me, the imagination is very important. And you can only do that if you are in a place.
Now we go back to Pinochet. Pinochet was...
Ja, zurück zu Pinochet vielleicht. Er wurde des Mordes angeklagt, nicht des Völkermords oder der Folter. Das Interessante ist, dass nach dem Völkerrecht Staatsoberhäupter immun sind. Und
and brought before a national court, but only before an international court. This was the argument from Chile, of course. But how is it today? It's quite a similar situation, perhaps. Do you think anything will happen? Would it be executed, all these arrest warrants we have now? Or what is the situation like today?
So, by way of context, these terms are very important and very particular and significant. So, the concepts of crimes against humanity, the killing of many individuals, was invented in 1945 by Hersch-Lauterpact and integrated into the Nuremberg Statute. The concept of genocide, the protection of groups, which is in distinction to the protection of individuals, was invented by Raphael Lemkin, also in November 1944, and also became part of the Nuremberg proceedings. And those concepts have evolved over time. They are both international crimes. When Baltasar Garzón learned on the morning of October the 16th, 1998, that Augusto Pinochet, who was in London in a hospital getting medical treatment, was returning to Chile the next morning, he spent 1 hour writing an arrest warrant. And the arrest warrant charged Augusto Pinochet with genocide, disappearance, torture, which are crimes against humanity. He was able to do this, ironically enough, because General Franco had, in 1971, passed legislation in Spain to bring genocide and crimes against humanity into Spanish law. So the irony is Garzón relied on Franco-era crimes in law to issue the arrest warrant. The arrest warrant goes by fax. It's sort of, the old ways it was done in those days. And it arrives at Scotland Yard, and Scotland Yard has an extradition squad, and they look at it and they say, okay, we've got to go and deal with this. And it arrives after the courts are closed, and so it will have to go to what's called the duty magistrate, who happens to be Nicholas Evans of Christchurch Hill, Hampstead, next to my house. And Nicholas has never given an interview to anybody except to me. And I spend a Sunday morning in his house. He says, yes, I'll tell you what happened. And he describes how he was at home having supper with his wife, and Scotland Yard called up and said, we're sending 4 officers. We need you to sign an arrest warrant. They mentioned the name, he said. He said, I'm not like you, Philippe. I don't do international law. I didn't really know who this person was. But they arrived half an hour later, and they put in front of me a little piece of paper, and it was a draft arrest warrant for genocide, crimes against humanity, torture, disappearance. And Nick said, again, I'm not like you. I don't do international law. I didn't know what these terms were. I'd never heard of these terms. So I crossed out genocide, I crossed out crimes against humanity, I crossed out torture, and I wrote murder. Disaster. The English courts do not have jurisdiction over the crime of murder committed in faraway Chile. It was the first big issue in the Pinochet proceedings. And so that caused all sorts of subsequent dramas. In the case of Augusto Pinochet, the issue was, does a former head of state have a basis to claim immunity from the jurisdiction of a foreign national court when the alleged crime is an international crime? Eventually, the arrest warrant was changed, and international crime was inserted, and all that was sorted out. But it had never happened before. There'd never been a case like it before. There had been cases before international tribunals, but it was basically only Nuremberg and Tokyo at that point. Yugoslavia, Rwanda, they had only just been created. They'd not taken decisions on these things. Sierra Leone, they'd not taken decisions. So we were in complete, unprecedented territory. And that's why there was so much international attention to it. And ultimately, the House of Lords said, no immunity under international law for an international crime with jurisdiction before a national court where a treaty provides an obligation on the state to investigate or prosecute. And that was the basis on which they determined that since there was a convention against torture which provided for an obligation to prosecute to investigate, extradite, or prosecute, there was no immunity for Pinochet in relation to the crime of torture, and that was how the case then continued. The precedent was hugely significant because it basically signaled to any head of state or head of government that if you act in a way that commits an international crime, you are at risk of arrest once you've left office. If you travel anywhere in the world, the courts have jurisdiction. But it left, of course, open the question of a serving head of state. And as an international lawyer classically trained, there's an important distinction for me between a serving head of state and a former head of state. And there's a big distinction between an international tribunal and a national tribunal. And the issues that we've got now, for example, in relation to Mr. Putin, in relation to Mr. Netanyahu, raise complex issues which we don't have time to get into now. But in a nutshell, so that you understand the situation, these arrest warrants are issued not by a national court, but by an international court. And the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over any allegation of crimes within the jurisdiction of the court committed on the territory of a party to the statute. Ukraine was effectively bound by the statute, and therefore there's no question that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over crimes committed by a person of any nationality on the territory of Ukraine. By analogy, the United States is not a party to the ICC statute. If an American commits a crime of genocide on the territory of the United Kingdom, which is a party, the ICC plainly has jurisdiction. And it's exactly the same thing for Russian crimes committed on the territory of Ukraine. It doesn't matter that Russia's not a party to the statute. So they have jurisdiction, but the question is, can they exercise that jurisdiction in relation to a serving head of state? And the serving head of state here is Mr. Putin, and under general international law, he has absolute immunity. The International Criminal Court has ruled in another case that a serving head of state of a country that is not a party to the statute of the International Criminal Court cannot claim immunity from jurisdiction. That is a controversial decision. It is not accepted by all academics. I have to confess, I have trouble with it, because I don't see a legal basis on which an immunity that is claimable by Russia for its president can be lost by operation of a treaty to which Russia is not a party. And of course, the same principle applies in relation to Mr. Netanyahu, who's not head of state but head of government, and is a serving head of government. Mr. Gallant was a serving minister, but he's no longer a serving minister. So there's no issue, to my mind, in relation to Mr. Gallant, but there will no doubt be issues in relation both to Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Putin that will be argued, and the courts will then have to decide what happens. But the bottom line is the combination of Nuremberg, the Yugoslav tribunal, the Rwanda tribunal, and the judgment in the Pinochet case has been a game changer. It's revolutionary, it's forever, it's not about to change, and that sends a very clear signal. So I've always said international law is a long game. You can't expect these kinds of changes to occur and then everyone goes, oh yes, okay, we give up, no problem, we accept everything. It will be decades before we emerge with a clear set of practices. I should also say this is very relevant in another context right now. As some of you will know, in July of last year, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a judgment in a case concerning the immunity of former President Trump in relation to allegations of crimes committed as official acts whilst he was President of the United States. And the Supreme Court, in its wisdom or not, ruled that a former President of the United States has a presumption of absolute immunity for any official act while President. And they did not create a carve-out for international crimes. So in the United States, too, there will be continued debate about how to interpret and apply the ruling of the Supreme Court. This, in a nutshell, is a big, continuing issue that is not free from complexity. Anyone who says to you it's simple is not being honest.
But now we go a little bit back to go back to the book. From the German and Austrian perspective, it is not understandable at all why high-ranking Nazis have been protected by the US and also by so many South American states. But in those days, of course, the Western world was more frightened of the communists and communist agitation than that the prosecution of the Nazis was not so important. And you write about it quite often in your book. Once you write the Camellios, so this was the family Walter Rauff worked for, knew about his past and, like him, were virulently anti-communists. And I think this is a very important topic in your book because from our perspective, of course, we want that all Nazis are persecuted. But of course, from this point of view, it's really different.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, I'll take the story of Walter Rauff to just tease out the issues because it's much easier to comprehend, or at least my brain works in such a way that if I've got an actual story, it's just easier to understand. The story of Walter Rauff is literally unbelievable. If it was a novel, people would say this is not possible. It could never happen like this. Rauff is chased for mass murder after 1945. Mass murder in the gas vans, which he has managed, mass murder in Tunisia, mass murder in Italy, where he's been chasing partisans and just wiping out entire villages in Italy. His name is still renowned today in Italy, and there are still cases going on now about the consequences of his actions in and around Milan. It's a continuing story. He escapes, he goes to Syria, he writes to Wächter in 1949. Wächter dies in mysterious circumstances, and Rauff then decides to follow his own advice that he's given Wächter and go on the rat line to South America. He goes first to Quito, Ecuador, where he sets up with his wife Edith and his two children. Remarkably, the British love a sense of irony. It's built into our DNA. It's my British side, if you like. And the discovery that Walter Rauff's first job, the man who ran and operated the mobile gas vans across Central and Eastern Europe for 2 years, killing hundreds of thousands of human beings, what is his first job when he gets to Quito? He becomes a car mechanic for Mercedes-Benz. That is the sort of irony of history. They intend to stay there forever, but in 1956, they've arrived in 1950, the Rauffs meet a lovely Chilean couple who say, you're in the wrong country. You should be in Chile. Rauff knows Chile because he's been in the Navy and he's visited Valparaiso and Punta Arenas in 1925. And the couple say, lots of lovely Germans in Chile, we like people like you, you'll be very welcome. They move to Chile. They set up in the southernmost town on the whole planet of this world, Punta Arenas, where I've been to many times, an amazing place in Patagonia. And life is great. In fact, life is so great that not only does Walter Rauff have a job as the manager of the Pesquera Camellio king crab cannery, but it gets even better than that. He is hired as an agent of the BND, the West German Secret Intelligence Service. I know, it's literally unbelievable. 4 years later, as a consequence of certain documents emerging in the famous Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, in which documents fingering him as the architect of the gas vans, leading to cross-examination in court, where Eichmann is asked by the prosecutors about his role in the gas vans, and Eichmann says, that's nothing to do with me, that was down the corridor, same building, that was the Rauff fellow, nothing to do with me, that one. And the West German prosecutors in Hanover turn their attention to Walter Rauff, discover that he's living in Chile, and in the same style as Pinochet 35 years later, send a request for his extradition to West Germany for genocide and crimes against humanity. Total panic in the BND. as you can imagine, because you've got one side of the West German government chasing him for mass murder, and another side of the West German government benefiting from his services as a secret agent reporting on communist activity in Chile and Cuba and Venezuela and various other places. You couldn't invent it. It's crazy. You have to understand that a lot of my writing is deeply informed by the fact that for 20 years I have wonderful neighbours. My neighbour in Hampstead was the great writer David Cornwall, otherwise known as John le Carré. And I had a role in writing all of his books because, in the last 20 years of his life, if any of you read John le Carré novels, you will have picked up that in every John le Carré novel, there is a disgusting lawyer. He hated lawyers. And my job was always to make sure that the lawyer was portrayed accurately, dressed like a lawyer, spoke like a lawyer, acted like a lawyer. So he'd turn up at the front door, ring the doorbell. He'd be standing there with his manuscript of 500, 600 pages, and he would just say usual procedure. And the problem was he never put a little yellow sticky in which said page 293 is the disgusting lawyer. So I'd have to read everything. But I learned with that his techniques of how he got people to carry on reading, and he was very generous. And I learned also a lot about espionage. He was fascinated about the Ralph story, absolutely fascinated about the Ralph story, and he taught me a lot about the BND. As you know, no one knows more about the BND than John le Carré in the English-speaking world. So he taught me a lot about what Ralph was doing. Anyway, so Ralph, the BND decides this is very embarrassing, and they decide to terminate his employment immediately, but to backdate the termination by 6 months so that it cannot be said that a BND agent has been subject of an arrest warrant for mass murder. Okay? I mean, they really are. It really beggars belief. So he fights off the extradition request because Chile has a 15-year statute of limitations. And that means by 1963, crimes alleged to have been committed in 1941 and 1942, it's too late. You can't address them. He goes back to Punta Arenas, carries on for another 10 years as the manager of the Pesquera Camello, overseeing the export of crab meat in small tins to Austria, Germany, France, and other places. Vastly profitable activity. And then on September the 11th, 1973, miracle of miracles, coup d'etat in Chile, and you could not invent this, his friend from Quito, Ecuador, becomes the president of Chile, because it's Augusto Pinochet, who has brought him to Chile. I mean, literally unbelievable. He writes to his sister in Hanover, I am now like a protected monument. And in my mind, the question arises, did Ralph contribute to the allegations, to the crimes that landed on my desk many years later in 1998? What I understood about Ralph, who is not in the same quality of individuals, intellectually or culturally or otherwise, as Hans Frank and Otto Wächter, is a more regular kind of person, a more regular kind of mass murderer, that he not only had a hatred of Jews and blacks, and his correspondence is just filled with vitriol, and even better, he was visited in 1979 for 4 days by Karl Wolff, the former number 2 of Heinrich Himmler, and in the company of a famous German journalist for Stern magazine called Gerd Heidemann. We can come back to that if you want. It's literally couldn't unbelievable. And for 4 days, they just sit in Ralph's house talking, and miraculously, Heidemann records the conversations. And transcripts are produced, and I've got access to all the transcripts and all the conversations. And so his hatred of Jews and blacks and anyone he hates, and there's a lot of people, extends to communists. And so Pinochet is just a bastion against these dreadful communists. And frankly, and he's very clear about it, we should just exterminate them. There's no problem at all just getting rid of them. They're a pestilence, and we just get rid of them. And so it's essentially a continuation of the Cold War struggle, which Austria knows as well as any country in the world, in South America. And that explains the context of what has happened. But there are many ironies of what happens next. He absolutely despises certain people. He despises the man he refers to as Heinrich Kissinger, because he's a Jew. Even though, unbelievably, whilst Kissinger was hunting Ralph in 1945, by 1973, they're on the same side, pro-Pinochet. But this, nevertheless, doesn't excuse the fact. And the one person Ralph is more frightened of than anyone else in the whole world is a Viennese gentleman called Simon Wiesenthal. And the correspondence is unbelievable. He's constantly writing about Wiesenthal, who's chasing him and hunting him. And he even, in his Christmas cards, when he finds a newspaper article in the Chilean newspaper, cuts out the photograph of Wiesenthal and sends it to his nephew in West Germany. It's a very, very peculiar situation. But it's all about communism now. I mean, the Jews are there. They're a problem. They run everything. They're a total disaster. We should get rid of them also. But his work is motivated by the communists. And one of the ironies of the book, and it hasn't yet come up in any of the conversation, is that the Jewish community in Chile is actually, to a significant extent, not exclusively, it's divided, but to a significant extent, very supportive of Augusto Pinochet. And this raises all sorts of other issues in my mind as I'm doing the research and doing the book. In short, life is unbelievably complicated.
Of course it is. You're right. I had an instinct that Ralph was involved, but I also had growing doubts in the absence of evidence. There were no documents. But how does a lawyer proceed when assumptions couldn't be backed up by facts? Is it a little unsatisfactory, I suppose?
So, when you're in court, you can prove your case. I mean, we have here a very distinguished criminal judge of the Austrian court, so I don't want to say how this is done in Austria, but I assume it's in the same way. You rely on evidence. You rely on documents. But in Chile, something happened in 1977 that meant there are no documents. And I suspect, but I have no evidence for this, it's a speculation, that Ralph may have been behind this. They destroyed everything. In 1976, in September, Augusto Pinochet ordered the assassination of a man called Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. He had been Salvador Allende's defense minister, and he was murdered in DuPont Circle. His car was blown up. And the Americans went absolutely ballistic. I be careful with my words. They may be willing to turn a blind eye to certain excesses in Chile, but killing people in Washington, D.C. is not acceptable. The Americans basically tell Pinochet, you've got to close down the DINA. The DINA is the Secret Intelligence Service. This has got to stop. So the DINA is closed down, and the man who heads the DINA, Manuel Contreras, decides to destroy all of the documents. The entire documentary collection of the DINA is destroyed, although there is some allegation that Contreras kept some of the stuff up his sleeve to basically blackmail Pinochet in case Pinochet turned against Contreras. Now, interestingly, this comes much later in the book, I discover that Ralph worked very closely with Contreras. And Ralph, we have this in his own correspondence, everything, to his sister, where he would reveal little things, but he was very careful what he wrote, because he assumed his letters were being read. Rightly so, they were being read. He always told his sister, I'm never in front of the camera, I'm always behind the camera, and no documents. So there are no documents, which means in relation to what Ralph's involvement was, and in relation to all of the cases involving the crimes of the Pinochet era, you are left to rely on witnesses, on testamentary evidence, testimony given by people who've seen things or done things. And in the end, my ability to come to a very clear conclusion that Ralph was involved in the most appalling way one could imagine, we'll maybe come on to it, was that I found witnesses. I found individuals who told me they had been personally interrogated and tortured by Walter Ralph, and they told me exactly the same story. The book is called Londres 38 because Londres Street in the heart of Santiago, very close to the Moneda Palace, the presidential palace, was one of the main centers of detention, torture, and disappearance. And I met one man called Leon Gomez, who was detained and held there for several weeks in July 1974, described to me at length how he was tortured, what happened to him, and said to me, Walter Ralph was in the room while I was being tortured. He didn't personally switch on the electricity machine. He issued instructions, and he sat behind a small table with a typewriter on it, typing in relation to the questions and in relation to the answers. And I later got testimony from another person who'd been there the previous month, who had not yet read the book, and who described Ralph being in the room and doing exactly the same thing. And then a third person described to me the same thing, a man who did not recognize Ralph's face because he always had a hood over his face, but recognized a German accent. And when I played a recording of Ralph's voice, he confirmed that was the voice. Ralph had a very, very distinctive voice. So this built up a first impression. But, and I don't know how an Austrian judge would look at this, there was a tiny part of me that sort of doubted. I had a residual tiny doubt. Could it be credible or not? So I then decided to go to the other side of the story, and eventually was introduced to two men who had served in the Dina, who had been involved in detentions, in torture, in killings, and in disappearances. And both men had turned what we call in English state's witness. They basically cut deals which said, if we give you evidence of what we saw and what we were involved in, will you either not prosecute us or show leniency in terms of how you treat us? And the principal person that I spoke to was a man called Jorgelino Vergara, who is known in Chile as El Mocito. El Mocito means the junior waiter, or the junior butler. And he has this name because in 1974, at the age of 14 and a half, he was hired by Manuel Contreras, Pinochet's right-hand man, to serve as the junior waiter in the home of Manuel Contreras. And he did this for 4 years. And he saw everyone who came in. He attended meetings, he served the drinks, he was present at many of the most significant meetings, and he became, after 2007, one of the key witnesses in the prosecutions in Chile. And he cuts a deal with the Chilean police and prosecuting authorities. I will tell you everything I saw, everything, from the age of 14 to 18, but the moment I turn 18, I will share nothing at all with you, and I want a non-prosecution deal. And the Chilean police agree to this. As a result of his testimony, dozens and dozens and dozens of very high-ranking officials are serving lifetime sentences, imprisonment, corroborated by other witnesses, but he has been one of the principal people. And he is the one who gave me detailed, granular information about his engagement personally with Walter Ralph in the company of Manuel Contreras. And at this point, it gets really nasty and raises many fundamental questions. But the bottom line of it is, in the town of San Antonio, the Pinochet regime on September the 11th, 1973, acquired another pesquera, another fishery, the Pesquera Arauco. And they acquired it because the Pesquera Arauco had 310 Chevrolet C10 and C30 refrigerated vans. And they were going to use those vans to transport detainees and then to dispose of the corpses as appropriate. In fact, Leon Gomez told me he was transported in a Pesquera Arauco van. The Pesquera Arauco also had in its facility the largest fish meal production plant in Chile. 30 tons of fish meal every day to be used to produce chicken feed. Your imagination begins to open up when you understand. Fishermen from the Pesquera told me that on the afternoon of the 11th of September 1973, the military turned up at the Pesquera, sealed the facility, and took it over. So this is pretty weird. Why would the army take over a fishery in San Antonio? San Antonio happens to be the headquarters of Manuel Contreras at a place called Tejas Verdes. So you can begin to join things together. But the bottom line of it is that El Mosito was able to describe to me the role of Walter Rauff in the management and operation of the Chevrolet C10 and C30 vans used to transport and disappear people. As it sinks in, you realize what I'm saying. In 1941 and 1942, it was gas vans. In 1974 and 1975, it was refrigerated vans. This was the same individual. And this is, I'm told, the first time we have hard evidence in witness form of any senior Nazi who escaped to South America being directly and personally involved in the crimes of one of the dictatorships in South America. All of the rest, in relation to all of the other people, it's rumors and it's allegations and it's unsubstantiated. But with Rauff, we now have clear testimony and evidence. And that, I think, is what makes this story so very shocking, that one individual, if you like, returned to the tools of his trade 30 years after he had originally engaged in them.
Thank you. I think this was, it was not the end, of course, but I have to look at my watch. Ja, ich gehe jetzt wieder auf Deutsch über. Wir haben natürlich jetzt auch ein bisschen...
Let me switch back to German. There's some time left for questions from the audience. As you can see, there's a great number of different topics and issues in the book. There's also a list of many pages of names at the beginning of the book so that you can keep an overview. I'd say we start a brief question and answer session, but I would really like to ask you to focus on the book and to keep your questions short because we have a large audience. Maybe many people want to ask questions unless you're still flabbergasted by what we heard. So please, if you have a question, wait for the mic to arrive for you because we have a live stream and we want everyone to hear your question. There are some people with microphones who will come and join you as soon as you raise your hand. Who would like to start? And you can ask your question in German, as Philipp Sands also understands German very well.
Okay. Ja, Sie haben ja zu Anfang gemacht.
You said in the beginning that you had access particularly to those people where there was some personal connection. But what about Chile and persons you did not have any personal connections to? Was it difficult to get access to those people to start talking about these difficult topics? Did you sometimes have the feeling that it was difficult to get a hold of information because it was simply difficult to talk about this?
You'll need to help. You'll need to give me the nuance of the question.
Was it complicated to find contact to people in Chile to speak about this not very easy topic?
Thank you for this question. You're referring to something that cuts across the whole of my work and which you'll be very familiar with also in Austria. I grew up in a family of silencers where people just did not want to talk about things. And in my work and in the cases that I do, I find that this is a universal phenomenon. Whether you're dealing with a case in Kosovo or Rwanda or Yugoslavia, it takes 2 generations to begin to really want to talk about things openly. And Chile is no different. One thing that's very important, and I meant to say this earlier, there were no cases in Chile until Pinochet returned to the country after his arrest, and he was held for nearly 2 years. And then the cases began. So there was a void for many, many years. But that void was not complete. And into the void stepped filmmakers, writers, poets, and others. And there is a very significant literature in the period of the 80s and the 90s in Chile, which deals, and the 2000s, which deals with these issues. And so people have been sensitized. So when the Santiago taxi driver is telling me with certitude that Ralph worked for Pinochet, he's basically referring to rumors, but also to literature. And I'd refer you in particular to the extraordinary book by Roberto Bolaño, Nocturno en Chile, Nights in Chile, where in 1997, when the book is published, Bolaño invents a relationship between Ralph and Pinochet. For me, this was remarkable because it coincides with what I later discovered. So talking to people, I think, is an art and building up relationships, but I'll give you one hard example of how it works. I sat through all the Pinochet proceedings in the House of Lords and in many of the other courts over a 2-year period. In the House of Lords, my next-door neighbor was a gentleman called Miguel Schweitzer. You'll have picked up the German origins. Happened also to be Jewish. And I remember, and I won't easily forget, the first day in court when I arrived, and I happened to find myself seated next to Miguel, and Miguel stood up, very elegant man, beautiful suit, fabulous head of hair, smells impeccable, perfumed, marvelous, absolutely charming, holds out his hands and says, Miguel Schweitzer, Augusto Pinochet's human rights advisor, 1974 to 1985. And I'm thinking, okay, you know, but one strange thing that happens, and lawyers here will understand what it is that I'm saying, is you sit next to someone for weeks on end and you build up a relationship and you start having little conversations. You know, you start off like this and then you sort of start talking and the guy's the lawyer. So it turns out Miguel Schweitzer is a fantastically interesting person. And we get on. 1963, unbelievably, as an 18-year-old law student, he is helping his father, Professor Miguel Schweitzer, write the arguments for Walter Rauff on statute of limitations. Unbelievable. This I only learned much later. 1972, he becomes the legal advisor to Augustin Edwards, owner of the biggest and most right-wing and pro-Pinochet newspaper in Chile, El Mercurio. 1975, he becomes the human rights advisor. In 1977, when the scandal erupts with the killing of Orlando Letelier, who does Augusto Pinochet choose to be his emissary in Washington? Miguel Schweitzer, to negotiate a deal with the Americans that they won't try to extradite Contreras or anyone else from the DINA. It succeeds. 1980s, he becomes Pinochet's ambassador in London. He is recalled. As he told me, I was becoming too close to Margaret Thatcher. And late 80s, he becomes Pinochet's foreign minister. So he loves Augusto Pinochet. But we become friends. And the reason we become friends, in part, by 2016, 2017, is he's read East-West Street, and then he reads Die Rattenlinie. And he sees that I treat people respectfully in my interviews. Even if I disagree with them, I'm very respectful and courteous how I treat with the material. He says, I'll give you the inside story of the case. And we spent hours and hours and hours talking about his side of the story. And the points of detail are fantastic. Many of you may well remember the moment. Well, actually, you probably don't. In England, it was a huge thing. In Chile, it was huge. And in Spain, it was huge. Pinochet flies back. He's supposed to be demented, gaga, unfit for trial, ill, blah, blah, blah. And people are amazed when the wheelchair is wheeled off the plane, and the moment it reaches the tarmac, he gets up, he stands around, he waves his stick, he embraces, and he looks fantastically healthy. As you'll see in the book, it was a complete lie about his unfitness for trial. There was a deal between the British and the Chileans. This was shocking for many, many people. Miguel told me the story. They're on the plane together back to Santiago from London, and they have to take the very long route all the way down the bottom of South America and up the other side because the wretched Brazilians and Uruguayans and Argentinians won't allow the plane to fly over their airspace because Pinochet's in the plane. So the flight adds an extra 4 or 5 hours. As they approach Santiago and they're drinking champagne, Miguel and his colleague, who's also been very generous in talking to me, also a former foreign minister, Hernán Felipe Errázuriz, say to Pinochet, look, you're demented, you're gaga, you can't just walk off the plane like you want. You've got to go off the plane in a wheelchair. And he refuses. Pinochet is a very proud man. He says, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to walk off the plane. And they eventually persuade him and say, look, it'll be a catastrophe. If you walk off the plane, everyone's been told you're unfit for trial, you're unhealthy, you can't remember anything, you don't know anything. You will lose all your support. So he agrees to be wheeled off the plane. But, says Miguel, we screwed up. We made a terrible mistake. We forgot to tell him to wait until the wheelchair was in the terminal where no one could see it before he got out of the wheelchair. And so it was a catastrophe, which ended up meaning the Chilean courts ruled he was fit for trial. So these were the kinds of stories, coming to your question. The simple answer is, if you want to talk to people, you've got to treat them with respect, and they have to know that, and you have to go back repeatedly and be willing to make the trip to Chile, not on the internet, not by telephone, and take the time to be in their home and speaking with them in order for them to be willing to speak. And one of the things I feel most proud of with this book is that when we launched it a month ago, because it's only new and just out now, in Chile, the first events were in Chile. I thought this was very important politically. It's a Chilean story. In the Spanish edition, published by Anagrama, Walter Rauff's grandson, who is also almost unbelievably called Walter Rauff, came to the launch. I'd had many sessions with him, and interestingly, he accepted that his grandfather had been involved with the gas wagons and the crimes of the Nazi era, but he had real difficulty with the idea that his grandfather was involved in the crimes in Chile, and we just agreed to disagree respectfully on that. But he came to the launch with his daughter. And this meant a lot to me because it signaled that he felt I had treated him comfortably and respectfully and well. He has no responsibility for the acts of his grandfather in my book. And I express my appreciation to him and to others that I have spoken to who are descendants of stories on the other side of my family story. Some of them are here today. Horst Wächter, Friederike Wächter, Frederica Wächter, Ernst 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 Wächter, Nicholas Frank, Francesca Frank, and others who have given me time and been generous. I grew up on one side of the story, and I didn't know about the other side of the story. And to spend time with the descendants of people on the other side of the story has been a really important thing for me in many different ways, to learn to think about how it is to be on the other side of the story and understand the complexities of that and the silences on the other side of the story, which there are in Chile, as in Austria, as in Germany, as in Britain in terms of British acts of wrongdoing, as in any country where things have gone wrong. So this is a really important question, and I'm very grateful to you for it.
So I think one more question is possible.
Great.
Ich stelle es auf Deutsch und auf Englisch. Wie lang haben Sie...
For how long did you work on the book? 15 years, if I calculated well, or was it more than 15 years? How long did it take you? Thank you.
Well, I came across in the castle of Horst Wächter in about 2014, 2015, the letter written by Walter Rauff to Horst's father. And that immediately catalyzed an interest. And so the first interview that I did for the book was with Baltasar Garzón, the famous Spanish judge who in October 1998 issued the arrest warrant from Madrid to London. And so you could say that the research started in 2015, but I can assure you, lest you get worried about my state of mental health, it's not full-time. The way I work, and it's the same with the cases, and the international cases are the same, they take quite a long time, and the way my brain works is I like to digest things and think about things and challenge my own assumptions, and so it's done over a very long period of time. So you could say it was 10 years in the writing, but it wasn't full-time. I think the first draft of the book, and I find writing the first draft, we agreed we'd talk a little bit about the act of writing, I find the writing the first draft the most complex. I don't have, this is probably more my British side rather than my Austrian side, I don't have a system where I structure in minute detail how the book is going to be. I have like one page of paper where I have a rough idea of how I'm going to do it. And this book was very complex because I'm telling two different stories, which on their face appear to be completely disconnected. They operate at different times and in different places. And I was inspired actually by a friend, a writer friend, Hisham Matar, gave me the book by Vargas Llosa called The Goat, The Feast of the Goat, which is exactly this. It's a double story. You first read story one, then a bit of story two, then back to story one, then back to story two, and then eventually, at the end, it connects. So the first draft would have been ready in about 2022. And then, for me, the interesting bit of the writing begins. I find doing the first draft very time-consuming, very difficult. My children also think that I am pathetic because I am a one-finger typer. I type out all my own stuff, and it's... So my children are just like, they come in and they're just like, it's really pathetic. But it works well for me because that's about the speed in which the story emerges on paper. And so I'll do 500 or 600 words a day, and in the end you've got a draft of 130,000, 140,000 words, and then it goes to your editors and they come back with critique. And it's very interesting for me on this one, for the first time in any of the books, I worked not just with my English editor, but also with my Spanish editor. And this was fascinating. This is culturally different. And I was speaking last night actually to my German editor, and I think next time I'm going to try also with my German editor, because the editors bring their own cultural baggage to the issue. So for example, the English editor doesn't like all the literary stuff, doesn't like the Bolaño, Neruda, get rid of all this stuff. You know, the British are very pragmatic. Why do we need all this stuff? It just adds extra pages. It slows down the readers. The Spanish editor was totally the opposite. this is the best bit of the book, you must have more of it. And so I'm sort of, articulating between two different writing styles. And on this one, I must confess I was more attracted to the Spanish approach. I always had a sense that this book would do better in the Spanish-speaking world than in the English-speaking world. And interestingly enough, the Spanish editor wrote to me last night to say, amazing, we've already had to go into a second printing. In 3 weeks, it's sold more than 10,000 copies, which in Spain is a lot of copies for a non-fiction book. And so this act of writing is with a team of people. Linking your two questions, many of the people that I spoke with didn't speak English. And so I had the benefit of a simply fantastic PhD student from my university, Montserrat Madariaga, who accompanied me in every single interview, which meant, it was wonderful, that I had another pair of eyes and ears to test my interpretations of what was being said. But it also meant that it was very time, it added even more time of having conversations. I mean, the moment where this became most significant was when we met the man called Anatolia Zarate, who had the hoodie. I told you about the man in the hood who recognized a German voice. And when we finally tracked him down and arranged a meeting with him, and we spent quite a few hours with him in his home, he's now 86 years old, but a very intelligent and agile mind, the son of 2 medical doctors. He himself was graduated as an engineer, very precise brain. I liked this a lot. But he spoke a bit of English, but he also spoke mostly in Spanish. And as we watched him, watching Ralph in this video and listening to Ralph, what we both observed was extraordinary. His body literally froze. He grasped his hands like this and started to sweat profusely and breathe very heavily. He was sort of in a state of mild shock, and he just then, after a few minutes, said, this is absolutely the voice that I heard. And it was very helpful for me to have Montserrat with me, because I might not trust my own judgment about what I'd seen, and having someone else there meant that the veracity and the authenticity. But all of this adds to time, and I think for these kinds of books you've got to work over extended periods of time. And it was the same when I was writing East-West Street, which started in 2010 and that was published in 2016, and Die Rattenlinie was 2014, 15 I started, and that was published in 2020. And I went to visit Hagenberg and spent time with Nicholas Frank repeatedly. I mean, many, many visits. And I think that's how one needs to do, that's how I need to do these things. So don't get, I think it could have been quicker, but I think it would lack the heft that it has and the nuance that it has if it was done in a rush. And of course, I have a day job. I'm a very lucky person. I'm a university professor. I do cases before international courts. I'm not doing it for income. I'm doing it because I'm just fascinated about the subjects, and that means there's no rush, there's no economic incentives to doing it. In fact, quite the opposite. The longer it takes, you use up all of your advances on these ridiculous 8 trips to Chile or whatever, and research assistants and so on and so forth. But I'm a big believer in slow is beautiful. Yeah.
Vielen Dank. Many thanks, Philippe. It was a pleasure, and I think we could stay with you for hours, but I know that I have to finish now, because the people from the Parliament told me. Es gibt jetzt im ersten Stock in der Säulenhalle, in der Wunderbaren, gibt es ein Glasl zu trinken.
There will be some refreshments in the columned hall. Also, some books on sale. I didn't ask Philippe Sands, but I'm quite sure that he will be happy to sign them for you. And there's a second table. He recommended some of the books he likes reading or he used for his research. They will also be available there. So if you're interested in knowing what he used as an inspiration, take a look at that. I would like to thank everyone from the Parliamentary Library. Let me also remind you that this library is open to the public. Feel free to come here anytime, including students who can currently not use the university's library. It's a perfect place for learning and studying with a really good atmosphere, and I'm pleased to see that these events have met with so much interest. Thank you once again. Thank you for being with us, Philippe, and please come and see us again.